Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to the Data Hub's second Library Tech Talk. The Tech Talk series is intended for researchers in the digital age, and it aims to help them find tools and discuss topics that help them in their research and help them improve their workflows and generally create scholarly work. So to that end, we are very lucky to have Dr. Zachary Turpin here discussing digital archives, shitty OCR, and the future of archival research. So I'll let him take it away.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for being here today. Those on Zoom, those who are here in person, I appreciate it. I will probably talk for about 20 to 30 minutes tops, and then there will, I think, be a brief survey, and then we can do some Q&A too. Unlike what I imagine are some other talks of this nature, this will not be the most technical of tech talks. I do work in the English department, so full disclosure, I think that is going to make this somewhat less than an explicitly technical talk. But we are talking about the use of technology in the 21st century as regards my research. And as you can see from my title, I'm particularly interested in the digitization of archives because that is fascinating and serves me well as a researcher. And also shitty OCR, and I will explain what that means shortly. But again, Dr. Zachary Turpin, here we go. I study American literature primarily. So when you think about the things that I teach and that I research, you may think of works like this, which is not untrue. I mean, these are the sorts of texts that go through my classrooms and that go through my writing. That is absolutely correct. But if you were to want to visualize the kind of work that I do, you might also think about something like this, rotting newspapers. That is not an untrue element of the kinds of research environments that I find myself in. Or, for example, this. I think oftentimes something like microfilm and microfiche is a highly overlooked element of archive text, particularly in American literature, but in world literature generally. So when I see an image like this, it makes me salivate because that's a lot of information buried in a very compact place. And microfilm is going to be important for this talk too, because microfilm is typically the vehicle by which texts go from this to, well, I'll get to it. They go to the digital. Yeah, they go to the digital. So much of this talk today is also about these so-called digital humanities. Digital humanities is a term you may have heard already. It might be self-explanatory, but if you don't know what it means, hint, you're already using them. Digital humanities is effectively any way that one interacts with texts in a digital way today. So this is a common example. You probably see something like this virtually every day of your adult life, I bet, as an undergrad, graduate researcher, or faculty member. These are digital humanities too. This is a fascinatingly thorough and complete archive of your communications with others that walks around in your pocket or your purse or your jacket, which is really weird when you think about it. These are digital humanities. Google Books is a digital repository for scads, like millions and millions and millions of books, which go back to, I think, the 1400s. They literally have incunabula, like books that were made before the advent of the printing press. They're digitized for you to read and search. Here's another example. Chronicling America is the Library of Congress's not comprehensive, but very large database of newspapers from all 50 American states, plus Guam and Puerto Rico. And it's really, really big. If you use ProQuest, for example, this is another instance of the digital humanities. Voyant, using tools like this is a freely available website, voyant.org, for analyzing texts. And scholars like me do a lot of text analysis as well. This is not necessarily my bailiwick, but if you ever do a Google Ngram search, for example, which is where you take, just Google Ngram and it will take you there. You input any word or set of words and it will show you approximately its usage over the past 200 to 400 years. And you can note interesting patterns. This, by the way, is an Ngram search of the word pattern itself. Looking at things like publications of total numbers of books per year, or there are scholars like Franco Moretti, who, for example, mapped all the places that are named in a particular novel to sort of see the placiness of different texts. There are things like genre analyses. All of these depend on text being available in a digital way to analyze in some sort of large scale mode. So this server farm is a way of representing that. There is a lot of text in the world digitally, like a lot. Just to mention some of the databases that I talked about before, and this is even a very limited subset of all the digital texts out there. Chronicling America, there's 20 million newspaper images that you can look at right now on the internet for free. Google Books has digitized 40 million books and counting. I think many of those books came from several large public university libraries, and they were digitized via basically like robot on a conveyor belt. This is pretty wild. There's a lot to go through. And more is being digitized every day. But this comes with a certain set of infrastructural and practical problems. And those problems are of interest to me because I'm a selfish researcher who wants to find certain things. The work that I do, those are not my hands, but they weirdly look a lot like them. The work that I do particularly involves looking for the kind of bibliographic fingerprints of certain relatively well-known authors, often in the 19th century, Emily Dickinson, Walt Whitman, Mark Twain, Charles Chestnut, etc., Louise May Alcott, and trying to locate more of their unknown publications, because authors of that era wrote very rapidly, often for money, and did not necessarily keep excellent records of their publications. So they effectively leave bibliographic fingerprints out in the archive, capital T, capital A. So how do you find them? Where do you locate those fingerprints? How do you find unknown publications by the author of your choice? Well, I'll show you an example of my research, like I guess you call it the workflow. Here is a picture of the poet Walt Whitman late in his life. It's not the best quality image, but it shows you something that you rarely see in images of the poet, which are typically composed in a studio. This is him in his home in Camden, New Jersey, when he is approximately 70 years old. He has about 2 years left to live. And as you can see, he is sitting in just a sea of personal papers. It is disgusting. If you've ever seen the show Hoarders, many researchers like to kind of, in an amateur way, pathologize Whitman as what we would now call a hoarder. I don't disagree. I mean, look at that. It's disgusting. But it's also very attractive to researchers like myself for the following reason. Whitman didn't just hoard anything. He hoarded paper. He was he became a newspaperman, so an assistant printer, and then a journalist and an editor, starting at around what we would say the age of 6th grade. So he does not complete the full run of primary and secondary school. He becomes a printer's assistant at the age of, say, 12. And that's what he does for much of the rest of his life before he's officially a poet and only a poet. Paper was rather expensive at the time for an individual who does not make a lot of money. So what newspapermen like Whitman would do would be they would swipe scrap paper from the office and they would use it. They would write on the front and then they would strike it through and they would write on the back. And Whitman kept these papers in trunks and he would move with them. He built different houses with his father in Brooklyn in the 50s, and he would move with his papers because they had notes about articles he was going to write. They had poetry he was writing down on the fly. They had all sorts of things, tax documents, and he kept them his whole life. It became a practice. And when he passed away, his 3 literary executors literally used shovels and shoveled these into barrels and then spent the remainder of their lives sorting them and transcribing them and printing them to the extent that they could. They didn't print everything. They didn't transcribe everything. A situation of this sort is, I think, fascinating for a researcher like myself who likes archival materials, is interested in filling out the unknown bounds of a writer's production, and particularly for a writer like Whitman who published in newspapers a lot. So say, unlike an Emily Dickinson, who mostly is publishing by sewing together her writings and keeping them in the home. What this led to when I was a doctoral candidate was me in my free time, whatever that means now, phrase has no meaning, looking through Whitman's notebooks and noting that there were some from, those piles of papers, there were some that looked like he had written plans toward articles or short stories that were not known to exist. There's a fairly famous notebook that you can see right here. It's called A Schoolmaster, for the first words written in the notebook. And in it, Whitman writes plans toward different short stories. They're about thieves who steal a wallet and they get smallpox from the wallet, or a pickpocket who goes to California and then is ironically hanged there. And the longest planned story is about this young legal aide named, Jack Engel. And he's an orphan who's in his 20s. He's learning the practice of law. He meets an evil Quaker lawyer who is his teacher, who is trying to inveigle money out of a young Quakeress who is his ward. Hijinks ensue. It's almost like it sounds like he's trying to write a Charles Dickens novel, and that's an unknown text in Whitman's body of work. And so I had looked through these and tried to find evidence of them in online newspaper archives, and I hadn't found anything. But this one, very fortunately, brought up, I guess you would call it pay dirt. So the name Jack Engle, E-N-G-L-E, sounds very common to me. It did at the time. But when I searched through newspaper archives of the 19th century, it turns out it's very uncommon. Other than, I think there are 2 race horses that are named Jack Engle, it's an exceedingly uncommon name, except that in this particular newspaper announcement in 1852, you can see the name appears. It says, "This week's Sunday Dispatch," it's a New York newspaper, "will contain the life and adventures of Jack Engle, an autobiography in which are handled all sorts of things, philanthropy and philosophy and crime and love and boarding houses in Wall Street. And you'll have to read it to properly understand what it's all about." This doesn't say the name Walt Whitman. This doesn't announce that it is in any way his text. But as a scholar of, then a budding scholar of Whitman, this, to me, it sounded like him, overblowing this ad and promising that it contains everything. You have to read it and buy it to find out what's inside. I mentioned before that microfilm is luscious to me. This is one of the reasons why. So as a young doctoral student, I had not interacted with microfilm in any significant way. But what I found when I went to my university library was that they did not have this newspaper digitally. They did not have it physically, but that it is available on microfilm from one university, and that is the University of Pittsburgh, who very kindly sent it in the mail to my institution. So one day my librarian said, "You have microfilm. You have an ILL, an interlibrary loan." I came to my institution. I went to the basement. I unspooled the microfilm into the reader, which was a new experience for me. And I turned to the week in question that was advertised. And there, without the picture that you see of Whitman, there was this thing called Life and Adventures of Jack Engle, an autobiography. And just like in that notebook, there are characters named Wigglesworth, named Jack Engle, named Covert. All of those very unique names are there. The plot is the same. Whitman's connection to this paper is fairly well known. So what I had and what I was looking at was an unknown novel by one of the great poets of the United States. And I was the only living person to have set eyes on it. It's a very transformative experience. Very. I did a lot of doctoral work on this. It has since been published in book form. It's not the best book you ever read, but it is a very shocking kind of revelation as he advertises. There are many things that he talks about that he does not say in his poetry. I actually located a similar thing at the same time, sort of the same work process, going through Whitman's notes. He writes some notes toward this kind of manual of men's health, like an urban men's health manual, which he is not known to have published. Doing the same thing, and I will abbreviate it for the sake of this presentation, I found, again, a serialized newspaper publication in 13 installments called Manly Health and Training to Teach the Science of a Sound and Beautiful Body. It is Whitman's disquisition under a pseudonym about all things men's health: exercise, beard length, diet, masturbation, prostitution, footwear, baseball, everything boxing, which he loves. These are the sorts of things that interest me. This is not the only thing that digital humanists in my field do, but it's just the thing that I have evolved to do, and it fascinates me. But that you have seen two examples of successful workflows. These worked out. Many don't, just as many, say, digital searches you might do don't. They're just gentle failures. The barrier to doing more work of this sort, and it's pretty major, is what I mentioned in the title of this talk. Do you remember what it is? Shitty OCR, that's right. And shitty OCR is the bane or the scourge of a number of digital humanists like myself. And I'll say why. OCR, for those who don't know, means optical character recognition. Optical character recognition is the way in which texts that are not born digital are made digital. And I can give you some examples. Here's just kind of, this doesn't mean anything. This is just a pictorial representation. But so an image with text in it of any kind, or say a PDF that does not have plain text behind it. I'll explain what that means. Or even a scanned document goes through optical character recognition. It's a kind of software system that then makes plain text. So for example, if you remote deposit a check and your bank makes you take a clear picture of the front and back, your bank is using a software that takes that image and all of those black squiggles, it uses those to approximate what letters they may mean. And then you, as a human, verify, yes, that says $1,000 for me, or whatever it is. Hopefully it's at least that much. Also, if you use Google Lens or another translating digital surface, it is doing the same thing. It is looking at all those little squiggles, and it is not, quote, reading them, because Google doesn't think, but it is taking the image of each squiggle and as closely matching as it can with known squiggles in certain languages, in this case, Japanese. And then it's telling you, because maybe you don't speak Japanese, that you are about to depart on a bullet train to Osaka. Congratulations, that's very cool. If you want to think of the human version of OCR, then think about CAPTCHA. Now, if you are old enough to recall CAPTCHA, if you had to make banking transactions or do something that indicated that you had to prove that you're not a robot and you're using a computer, you were at one time asked to type in these two words, right? It would be just two random looking words, typically wavy. And if you can't read them, you would click the refresh button and it would give you two more. What do you think you were doing when you did that? Assuming any of you can recall doing that. Why would they ask you to type in two words that are wavy?
Machines can't read wavy words.
Machines can't read wavy words. Now, interestingly, these words did not originally appear wavy. CAPTCHA makes them wavy as a kind of way of making it harder for a machine to read them. But these words are paired for a reason. You were given these two words because some machine that was doing at that time a rather primitive version of OCR could read one of them successfully and one of them unsuccessfully. One successful and unsuccessful. So for example, let's say a computer knew what the word on the left meant because it had several humans input the same word in this CAPTCHA system. So it knows that this is going to have the, quote, plain text, laughter, right? Meaning if you typed it into a computer first, that's the word that you typed. But it doesn't know what this other word is. And you can probably see why. Some of the letters have been squished together. And so a computer is going to have a harder time approximating what letters those mean. So CAPTCHA would basically have billions and billions of people doing daily transactions, doing human versions of optical character recognition. And let's say 3 people write in the word tackled, then it says, okay, they wrote in tackled and they wrote in the known word laughter, that says tackled. It has officially been OCR'd. And this was done billions of times a day. And this is effectively how Google Books digitize books in ways like this, sort of putting it to the masses via Bank of America transactions. OCR comes in many levels of quality. If you search through a book that is digitized on Google Books, chances are the plain text that has been generated is very nice, really, really nice. Something like this, you can see the page image on the left, you can see the text on the right. It's been highlighted for problems, but it's pretty clean. Not all OCR is that clean. You can see here, for example, I don't know why this original newspaper image is about Silver Dick Bland, but that is somebody's name. But you can see, if you're a human, you can probably read, Mr. Vincent Johnson is in receipt of a very interesting autograph letter from Mrs. Virginia E. Bland. The OCR created text is Mr. Lucent Johnson is in receipt of a very interesting autograph letter from problem. And it often gets worse than that. OCR that is more than, say, 5 years old is typically very problematic. As an example, I, at one point, was looking for a version of this Rebecca Harding Davis story called Waiting for the Verdict. And I just tried looking at the plain text underneath because it was available on ProQuest. And this is what it looked like. How could anyone make use of that? If this were the sole announcement, just like that Walt Whitman text I was looking for, the sole announcement of this, it would be behind the locked door. You never find it. There's no way to kind of do an end run around OCR that is this shitty. And things like CAPTCHA have since been largely abandoned by massive companies like Google in favor of reCAPTCHA, because now we are feeding the robot other things that it needs to recognize. So now Google Images wants to recognize crosswalks, bicycles, crosswalks, motorcycles, rather than knowing if that word says tackled or not. And I will leave to you how utopian or dystopian this feels to you. So what comes next? This is the part at which I can talk about what I do, what institutions can do infrastructurally, and then also what we can hope for. The three things I'll mention are Boolean workarounds. That's what I do. Better image scans, which is what institutions can do, money depending, and then AI-assisted OCR, which is possible. So I'll start with Boolean workarounds. As I mentioned before, this seems impossible to find, particularly if this were the only mention of a text. But with Boolean search, which one can do in many a search interface, ProQuest is a great example. You can insert certain operators that help you make your search terms fuzzy. Here's an example. So Rebecca Harding Davis, you can see her name in the Boolean author tool with little asterisks at either end. The asterisks mean as long as it contains these words sequentially, whatever comes before and after is of no consequence. Why this is interesting is because sometimes when OCR transcribes a text, it will omit things that we see as rather simple with our eyes, like line breaks. So as you can see here, this author byline is listed as Rebecca Harding Davis for the companion, because in the original text, it's Rebecca Harding Davis, new line, for the companion, new line. And the OCR program at the time just did not happen to recognize that there was a space there. That makes it more inaccessible to the researcher who's doing directive research. But this is one way that researchers like myself can go around the wall without needing any additional money. Better image scans is another possibility. This is going to get increasingly idealized. And yeah, better image scans. So one of the reasons that OCR that is shitty is not because the programs are particularly bad at matching up squiggles with known letters or letter combinations. It's because images that were taken 10 years ago, or 20 years ago, or 30 years ago, often have much lower resolution than images that might be taken last year. So as an example, you can see the dots per inch here vary quite a bit. And these are all the same scale across. They're 1 inch wide, 10 dots per inch, 20 dots per inch, 100 dots per inch. You can imagine as a computer that is not reading, but simply recognizing patterns, that if you're reading letters that look like the ones on the left, you effectively have myopia. You're nearsighted. You're like squinting to try to see in a computational sort of way what these letters are. Whereas if you are using images that have the resolution, say, on the right, it's a much different kind of endeavor. This is also complicated because newspapers of the 19th century that I study, they themselves have vastly different resolutions. Some of them are printed very cleanly, very clearly, have very little paper degradation, and have been archived in lovely humidity and temperature controlled conditions, and then lovingly imaged by archivists whom we all are indebted to forever. That's the ideal. That doesn't always happen. Sometimes newspapers were printed poorly, stored poorly, torn, foxed, molded, and then imaged like the image on the left once in the 1980s. I mentioned microfilm before. A common mode of digitization is not having a human turn newspaper pages and take each image, but to spool microfilm through a reader, which then blows up that image, captures it, and does this process. And that is not as clean or as clear as taking an image with a digital camera, but funding dependent. So one possibility is that if archival texts are imaged in a way that is high resolution, or even re-imaged, say the images are old and shitty, that will then not only assist researchers, but assist anyone who's trying to find anything. But that takes money. Last but not least, if we're thinking about the cost-benefit analysis, AI, as I think many know, is becoming increasingly powerful. Artificial intelligence of the sort that analyzes large language models does not think in the way that we do when we read, but recognizes patterns, much like what you just saw, recognizing the pattern, that regardless of resolution scale, this is the letter A. There are some who think that AI may assist in OCR, not by re-imaging, which costs a lot, not by the researcher having to do methodological workarounds, but by literally applying OCR software to shitty OCR to correct it. This basically involves taking the human out of the equation, training it with humans at first, and then with luck, yielding the kind of cleaned text that has effectively been laundered correctly. I don't know if that's the right word, that has been cleaned correctly, that has been error corrected. It's a complex process, and you can see it as sometimes iterative, and I don't expect you to read everything in the slide, but this is the way that it might work. The last thing I'll say before I stop talking for now is that this is not merely an activity for associate professors to do, or for full-time paid archivists to do, or for librarians to do. This affects every student of literature. This affects every undergrad and graduate student. This affects the common reader who expects to be able to explore what a scholar named Margaret Cohen calls the great unread in a way that is accessible and that is unaffected by serious error. Now, maybe those are high expectations, but I think that it's important. You know, when students think of the great unread, and we talk about this in my classes, they often conceptualize something that is a kind of pretty ideal of books, you know, like a clean library with mahogany and leather, and you get to walk through it and smell it and pull out a volume. What's in it? But what we talk about is that while that is certainly true, not every library is like a former monastic library of the Medicis. Oftentimes, the great unread looks like this, or the great unread looks like this. Here's an archive of, I think it's like images that have been rolled, posters, or like this. So I think what I would say is that the benefit of thinking about shitty OCR, both how to get around it yourself and how that we might institutionally or infrastructurally change it, is that it expands our conception of what literature is. It is that great mass of text, not just the things of which we are aware. So American literature, right? You were here, like right in the middle. But the vast, vast, vast body of unread text that is waiting for all of us, if only we can access it together. Thanks.
All right, so now it looks like we've got about half an hour for some Q&A if you would like. And like Dr. Turpin mentioned, I am also going to pop a quick poll in Zoom chat for the people in person. I would have paper copies, but I forgot, but I know where all of your offices are, so I will give them to you later. So if you want to throw your questions in the chat, if you want to unmute and talk, whatever works for you. And I'm actually going to start off with one question of my own. For Boolean searching, since you don't know exactly what the errors might be, what ways have you found to sort of optimize your searching so that you have to make as few searches as possible or spend as little time as possible on your searches?
That's a very good question. Do you want me to stop sharing, by the way?
Yeah.
Okay. Actually, as I do, I'm going to give you an example on the screen, if I can make it work. Okay. So stop share. Okay, I won't give you an example. No, I will give you an example on the screen. Okay, so let me get away from that. Give you some Google Chrome. All right, let's pretend that I am looking for a particular author. Yes, that's Bluey. Thank you specifically to Dulcie Kirsting Lark for pointing my children to that wonderful show, and also me, because we watch this again. Okay, so let's say you are looking for, you're doing a directive search, which means you know kind of what you want. So non-directive would mean you're going to go and just wallow in the archive in some capacity and be interested in whatever you find. Directive will mean that you are after a particular object or set of objects. Let's say that I want to find something by.
Can you share your screen for those?
Oh yeah, I can. Do it again. Boop. Okay. I'm trying to think of an author. So how about Louisa May Alcott? That's not how you spell it. There we go. Okay, Louisa May Alcott is a known author whose name is fairly recognizable. But we are not talking about human recognizability here. We're talking about computational recognizability. So one of the things that I do, besides using Boolean, which can modify what kinds of search parameters you have, right? You can be searching only in a particular decade, or only for things with words with fuzzy edges, or particular word combinations. You know, when you put quotes around a phrase, when you Google it, that is a kind of Boolean operator. You're saying, I want these words in this order specifically, spelled this way. Oftentimes what I will do is basically think like a stupid computer, or think like a myopic camera plus computer. So for example, when I think about the name Louisa May Alcott, and I will capitalize it because this is the way it would probably appear in a newspaper image, I would think, okay, if I have a bad camera or a poor image quality, an OCR that is not particularly capable, how might I misinterpret this? Well, I think oftentimes a lowercase I can look like a lowercase L. That's common. Or vice versa, right? Here is a good example. Or I might think about, and I'm going to put quotes around this. So if I were to search her name as it is correctly spelled, this will yield a set of results. If I search it this way, it will yield another set of results, all instances of this specific error. I might even do something like this to maybe loosen the search a bit. You can see how this would end up with a certain kind of combinatoric problem. You know, what if these are both misrepresented at the same time? But you can effectively think like a dumb computer. Another thing that I often do is squeezing a couple of words together, or even all of the words together, because again, oftentimes OCR will not recognize spaces or line breaks. It's just a common error. And that's one way to maybe not get there faster, but broaden the set of results that you would otherwise not get. I hope that answers your question. Basically, thinking dumber will actually be, in some specific archival research settings, a smarter way to go about things.
It looks like we have a question in the chat.
Okay.
Do you have any recommendations for individuals working with changes?
Oh, that's a very good question. Meaning, okay, working with OCR and scanning as far as making scans coherent. So as in a human who is helping process OCR scans? That's a very good question, Victoria. I'm curious what sort of that refers to. For context, I do all the scanning for course reserves. That's a great question. Okay, and also thank you for your service. We are all very indebted to you. As far as making scans coherent and useful, this is a much more difficult question because this is more where the rubber meets the road. Researchers who are doing directive research can think in certain nimble ways to effectively skip certain effort loads. You can avoid certain things by doing some of these methods or practices. When it comes to actually OCRing texts, I'm not really sure quite what I would recommend. I think one would be to occasionally, consistently be looking for better either AI-assisted OCR programs or programs that cost the same or less or are free that can do the same process at least slightly better, because these are being developed more and more quickly than they used to be. So I think, I don't know with a lot of certitude, but I think that it used to be that if you wanted to OCR scanned texts, that you had very few options. There was this, this, and this, and they have different price points. Now, because of the kind of AI rush, those price points have dropped significantly. Other than that, I don't know. I'm not really sure. I think that maybe as an institution, having certain best practices, like having images that have a certain minimum resolution, is often very important for machine readability. And us funding you as well as we possibly can, because your job is vital, is another good one. Often these things boil down to funding too, which is an unfortunate practicality. It's a great question.
Acrobat Pro does have recognized text built
OCR
into it.
Wrangler myself, as you know. A good example of shitty OCR is our Argonaut collection. And it's one of about capacity, right? And so we have this awesome resource, newspaper that's run by students for 100 years, 125 years. And we have them all digitized, but how we digitized it is that they sent out the microfilm to a contractor to digitize all the microfilm. And one of the problems that you kind of were alluding to there with the microfilm is that some of the microfilm wasn't captured very well. And so that's where the really bad OCR comes, when your microfilm images are slightly out of focus in the first place. And there's nothing that we can do other than going to the original material if we still have it in print. And so that microfilm sharpness is like a big limiting factor for newspaper digitization across the world. That's a big problem. And then the other part of that would be the challenge for the OCR, and that is the layout detection for newspapers. And that's where you're kind of seeing those breaking up points where it's like, this is actually not the sentence. The sentence actually breaks and goes down.
Absolutely.
Because they can't figure out those columns. So that's where I think the OCR engines have made a lot more progress in the last 10 years, where the layout detection is way better.
Yeah, I think that's very good.
And I think the other thing that you're talking about really too, or that feeds into what you're talking about, is one of the other really big challenges about bad, shitty OCR, as we're talking about. Keep trying to say shitty OCR, but forgetting. But it's literally the junk that gets into the search indexes. And so if you have a whole bunch of shitty OCR and we put it into our search index, the search index has to like take all these little stupid characters that are totally meaningless and then have tokens for those in the index. And so what we ended up doing is it just like killed our search index, because we have the scale of it and the scale of garbage that was in that index just made it worthless. And so in the end, we took a lot of that OCR out of our index because it was just so bad. And so that's where there's like this other, like lost literature where it's like, you can't even search it because the OCR is so bad.
It is. And it is a multifaceted problem. I think that you mentioned a lot of important things all at once. So number one, human intervention is still often very important. I think one of the reasons the Argonaut is so hard to OCR is that it's very creative in its layout format. The library has the wonderful exhibit of the Argonaut, or did recently. I've seen it all across campus, and oftentimes the layout is so unique to the eye that you know immediately that a stupid computer is going to have difficulty. But even with things that are less creative, like books that are printed in double column format, oftentimes if you maybe have tried to search through those, say there's like an Oxford companion to X and it's available on Google Books, and because you are, let's say not a lazy scholar, but optimizing your process, you're going to do a word search function on Google Books to find a page that contains a subject you want to think of specifically. Sometimes even Google Books will take those two columns and read them all the way across. And so what is yielded are these garbled sentences that look semantically like they're saying one thing and they say another, and then they go back to the first and go back to the second. The benefit of, say, AI in that case would be that AI can at least begin to recognize that that does not meet large language grammatical models, and it can do the adjustment. I'm also very wary of AI. So if anyone feels a little unsure about just the free reign of letting autocomplete internet edition do its thing, I'm with you. But yeah, I mean, these are problems at basically every level of intervention that often are the kind of analog to a copy of a copy of a copy. Yeah.
Curious, when you showed that example of a couple of examples of doing your Boolean sort of workaround, have you tried things like regular expressions as ways of creating, let's say, more complex and flexible ways of expressing a pattern of some sort that you want to find?
That's a good, I don't think that I have. I'm not sure what you mean by regular expressions.
Yeah,
So I'm not the Boolean expert, by the way.
it's a coding technique any computer science kid would know. It's just ways of saying I want to find the pattern inside this block of information. And you aren't sort of locked into the kinds of things you show. You could say, just ignore spaces in this pattern, or just show me any version of capitalization, or I want any 3 sequences of alphanumeric characters in a row that show up in any version or variation. It seems like it could be a more efficient way of getting that done.
That's all that I want. I want efficiency of that sort.
But if you're using interfaces like that ProQuest one that you showed, can't do it through that. So you have to use an API access. And I don't know if you've looked into those kinds of methods of accessing those purposes.
Not that specifically. So I can say 2 things. One is that in some cases, and by the way, ProQuest is like one of the best case scenarios. They have an advanced search function that has a lot of specific functionalities that others don't. And that's both a good thing, I mean, yay for ProQuest, and bad. Like if that's the best that we get effectively, then that for some researchers can be a problem. Just to give you an example, I defy you to find Google Books' advanced search function. Just if you go to Google Books and think, I'd like to break the search down and have some more parameters, it is not immediately available. And I think it's because Google Books knows it's not great. There are some things that search functions more or less automatically do. They don't necessarily think about capitalization, except insofar as that might affect how a machine has read a letter. You can do things like fuzzy searches in which the letters in a word, so say maybe the first and last, but not the letters in the middle, they can be, in a different order, or you can find words near one another, like these 2 words within 5 words of one another. But what you're describing is the kind of sophistication that I would very much like to pursue. I did have a CDIL faculty fellowship in which I did a much more primitive version of what you're talking about with the corpus of Emily Dickinson's works. But no, I would love to learn more. That's why these talks are so exciting.
And I guess along with that, have you pursued any funding associated with some of those ideas, like the AI one? I mean, it's kind of the shitty OCR problem. Seems like it's tailor-made to computer vision solving some of those, like figuring out what those letters are precisely. It just seems like it has ready to solve that problem in many ways. I'm just curious if you've tried or had success.
I agree. No, so far I have pursued funding only at the individual or group research level. So, human intervention with these things, more of the database workaround kind of model. But I think that you're right that AI to a very salient degree is now ready to make some of these things better for us. Yeah, and I also agree that it sounds pretty good for grant language, for example. But it would probably take a group of researchers with a kind of broad set of interdisciplinary skills to make that kind of project get off the ground. He said while twirling his evil mustachios. Yeah, that's right.
I think that there is like a sort of potential there too of, there was like the 1,000-book project or the million book, billion book.
I think it was million.
Original.
I think it was million. Yeah.
And the OCR is like way better than it was then. And so like I had a project where I was trying to create essentially a good reading text from digitized book that was in Internet Archive and a variety of other places that was digitized in that early era. But all the OCR is portable. And so you can't, they were producing, they have EPUBs, but they're like really bad. And so my project was essentially just grab all of the best digitized copies and then re-OCR it, and then use those texts to create a good text. And so there is just, even like with off-the-shelf stuff, like if you could just say, hey, Internet Archive, let's just literally run OCR on everything again.
Yeah.
There would be a huge improvement. So like, even without having to do any more digitization. But
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Other folks have questions?
How do you, this is less about tech and more philosophical.
Yay.
How do you handle research when you know that things haven't been digitized yet? I mean, this is our challenge as modern scholars, is that we can do a lot with digitized resources and say, I have exhausted everything that exists. But we know, working in archives, that we have not exhausted everything that exists. We've exhausted what is available on the internet. But there's a lot of microfilm that's sitting that hasn't been.
Most microfilm,
Yeah,
has not
and
been
there's a lot
scanned.
of newspapers that were never microfilmed
Yeah.
to begin with. So like, how do you kind of philosophically address, I have done what I can do. I have reached the terminus of what I can research. Or like, what are the lengths you go through to try to grab more information?
Yeah, that's great. Well, I'll answer practically and philosophically. I had my students in a graduate research methods course, which you lectured for this week. Thank you. It's archival research methods. And these are some of the things we're going to talk about. It's not nearly all. We're going to talk about physical and digital, and it's not merely how to use a ProQuest advanced search function. But we began by reading this short story by the Argentinian author Jorge Luis Borges. It's called The Library of Babel. And in it, it imagines a library in which there's a certain number of shelves in every room and a certain number of books in every shelf, and every book has a certain number of pages, and then each page contains this many characters, and they're all seemingly random. And it is from the perspective of like a person who inhabits this library, and it just goes on forever. And what this person says, the inhabitants of the library eventually figured out, is that the library is big enough to contain all possible books. That every single possible book of that length exists. And if there's a book of more than, say, 400 pages, then there's a book that's the first 400 pages, and there's a book that's the second 400 pages or whatever. And what the students find is that this is basically an expression of despair. That if you could imagine the kind of monkeys on typewriters sort of universe of data in which everything exists, but you can't get to it, right? There's not a catalog. There's not... Or there is, say there's a book that catalogs all of the books, but how do you find the catalog? It's basically philosophically the idea that everything is out there and you can't see it. I want them to begin with that existential despair, that like there are certain archival scenarios in which you are not ever even remotely going to get close to the thing you want, or maybe it's not there and maybe you won't know. It's a methods course. So really we then scale down from this large scale philosophical notion of you can never read it all, to there's a certain subset of all the texts in the world that you will have access to, that you'll be able to get to, that you'll find directly or stumble upon. And how do you optimize the process? That is our methodology, is thinking about the methods we have at our disposal and being flexible about getting to them. Philosophically, though, how do I deal with it? I think that archival research, either in physical materials, which I love, by the way, this talk makes it sound like I'm just like only care about digital stuff. I love physical materials in archives. Whether I'm dealing with physical or dealing with digital, most archival search is predicated on failure. I think Google gives you a very skewed perspective of what directive search brings to you. Think about how many times when you Google something, you have to go to the second page of search results, which now it's not broken into pages. Now it's the infinite scroll model. But think about how many times you have to click to the second page or the third page. How often does that happen to you?
Not very often.
Yeah, like ever anymore?
I just assume it doesn't exist.
Yeah, that's right. So because Google is such an advanced search engine, it can make it feel as if directive search of this sort, even if you don't know what you're looking for and you're asking a question, that generally failure is not the model of digital search. or physical search. That's not true. My undergraduates, my grad students, and I as a grad student learned that archival search generally is little instructive failures at all times. So you look and you don't find it, but you do get search results, and those are often very illuminating. What you do get returned is of as much interest as what you did not get. It does also yield to the idea that sometimes directive search is not what's important. Sometimes looking for a specific thing will eventually yield to, I'm going to wend my way through this archive, and I'm going to find things that I didn't know about. And that's why one of the quotes on my syllabus is the Donald Rumsfeld quote about what we don't know, the unknown unknowns, because that's a very important part of archival research as a mentality. It's humbling, you know, you have to know your size and relish the idea that there's more than you can possibly handle. That's a good thing. That's job security right there. It's fun. Anybody else? This has been a lot of fun. Thank you all for attending online, in person. I love talking about this stuff. Again, I had my email in the presentation before, but I can also put it in the chat. It's zturpin@uidaho.edu. If you ever want to get a coffee and talk about this, or if this makes you think about something in your own research and you want to, you know, just discuss things in a fun, interdisciplinary way, I'm always interested in how this can be pushed further.